My entitled family thought they were finally inheriting my millions, but they didn't realize the bankruptcy I announced was a brutal trap to see who would sell me out first. The leather of my wingback chair creaked, a sound as familiar to me as the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. I sat in the dim light of my study, the amber glow of a 30-year-old Scotch catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Outside the heavy oak door, I could hear the muffled sounds of my family gathering for our traditional Sunday dinner. To them, this house, the sprawling Blackwood estate, was more than a home. It was a trophy, a gold-plated promise of their future comfort. To me, it was a fortress built on 40 years of sweat, calculated risks, and 1,000 sleepless nights. I took a sip of the scotch, letting the burn settle in my throat. I'm 72 years old, and for the last decade I've watched my family transform. My daughter, Eleanor, and her husband Marcus had developed a taste for the finer things that their modest salaries could never truly afford. But it was my grandson, Leo, who worried me the most. At 24, Leo was the picture of modern entitlement. He drove a European sports car I had paid for, wore watches that cost more than a teacher's annual salary, and walked with the swagger of a man who believed the world owed him a standing ovation just for showing up. I loved them, truly, but love and trust are two very different currencies. Over the last few years, I'd noticed the way they looked at me, not with the warmth of kinship, but with the calculating eyes of vultures circling a weakening lion. They weren't waiting for me to pass so they could mourn me. They were waiting for me to pass so they could liquidate me. Tonight, the reading of the status was expected. Every quarter, I gave them a brief overview of the family holdings. It started as a way to teach Leo about finance, but it had devolved into a grotesque ritual where they practically salivated over the rising numbers of the Sterling Trust. I stood up, smoothed my vest, and grabbed the manila folder from my desk. Inside were the documents that would change everything. I walked into the dining room where the smell of roasted lamb filled the air. Leo was already at the head of the table, tapping impatiently on his phone. He looked up, a bright artificial smile plastered on his face. "Grandfather, you're late. I was just telling Mom we should look into that new development in Dubai. High risk, but with the sterling backing, we could corner the market before the end of the fiscal year." I sat down at the opposite end of the table. "The sterling backing, Leo? You speak as if the funds are already in your pocket." Leo laughed, a hollow grating sound. "Well, they're in the family, aren't they? And I'm the one who's going to take the sterling legacy into the next generation. You've done the hard work, Gramps. I'm just here to polish the crown." Eleanor chimed in, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "Now, Leo, don't be crass. Your father and I just want to make sure the transition is smooth when the time comes. We've been looking at the estate taxes, and we think we should start moving some of the liquid assets into our joint accounts now to avoid complications." I looked at them, my flesh and blood, and felt a profound sense of weariness. They hadn't asked how my heart was doing after my last checkup. They hadn't asked about the charity work I'd been doing in the city. They wanted to know about the liquid assets. "Funny you should mention that," I said, opening the manila folder. The room went silent. Even Marcus stopped chewing his bread. I pulled out a series of bank statements and legal notices, sliding them across the polished mahogany table. "I've spent the last 6 months conducting a thorough audit of the Sterling Trust and the Blackwood holdings," I began, my voice steady. "Between the market fluctuations, some poorly timed investments in the tech sector, and the rising costs of maintaining this lifestyle, I've had to make some very difficult decisions." Leo reached for the top paper, his brow furrowing as he scanned the numbers. His face went from expectant to pale in a matter of seconds. "What is this?" "Grandfather, this statement shows the primary liquid account is at zero?" "Not just that one," I said calmly. "The offshore accounts, the real estate holding company, and the secondary investment portfolios. I've had to liquidate them to cover a series of mounting liabilities. The Sterling Trust, as you know it, is effectively empty." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Marcus dropped his fork, the clang echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Empty?" Eleanor whispered. "Dad, that's impossible. There were tens of millions. How could you just lose it? What about our allowances? What about Leo's tuition for his MBA?" "I'm afraid the MBA will have to wait, or Leo can find a way to finance it himself," I replied. "The lifestyle we've been living was built on a foundation that turned out to be much more fragile than I realized. I've spent my life protecting this family, but I couldn't protect us from the shifting tides of the economy." Leo stood up, his chair screeching against the hardwood floor. His face was flushed, the veneer of the golden grandson cracking to reveal something ugly and desperate underneath. "Are you joking? You're telling me that after all these years of promising me a seat at the table, you've gambled it all away? My legacy. You've destroyed my legacy." "Your legacy?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Raising? I didn't realize you were the one who spent 40 years building Sterling." "You know what I mean," Leo shouted, his voice cracking. "I've spent my whole life being groomed for this. I've told people. I've made plans. I have debts, grandfather. Private debts that I was supposed to pay off when the next dividend hit." He grabbed the folder, flipping through the pages frantically, his eyes darting across the legal jargon. He was looking for a loophole, a hidden pocket of wealth, a glimmer of hope. But all he saw were transfer of ownership notices and account closure confirmations. "The house," Eleanor stammered, her eyes darting around the room as if the walls were already disappearing. "Surely the Blackwood estate is still ours. It's been in the family for 3 generations." I looked her directly in the eye. "The estate was leveraged to cover the final margin calls. I've received a notice of intent to vacate. We have 60 days to move out before the bank takes possession." Leo let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated devastation. He looked at me with a mixture of horror and betrayal. "You've left us with nothing? You worked your whole life just to end up as a failure? My legacy is gone?" He began to sob, not out of grief for me or our family history, but for the loss of the money he felt entitled to. He collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. I watched him for a long moment, my expression unreadable. I hadn't told them the whole truth. I hadn't told them about the private foundation I'd established in secret, or the complex web of trusts that were currently holding every single cent of the lost fortune under a different name. I hadn't told them that the bank taking over the house was actually a shell company I owned. This was a test, a brutal, necessary test to see who they were when the gold leaf was stripped away. Just as Leo looked up, his eyes red and full of spite, a heavy knock sounded at the front door. "Who is that?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking. "That," I said, checking my watch, "would be the process server. It seems the timeline for the liquidation has been moved up. They aren't just here for the house, Leo. They're here for the cars, too." Leo bolted for the window, peering out at the driveway. His face went from pale to ghostly white. "Grandfather, there's a tow truck, and there are 2 men in suits, but they're not from the bank." I stood up, adjusting my cuffs. "Then who are they, Leo?" Leo turned back to me, his phone buzzing in his hand. He looked at the screen, then back at me, his voice a terrified whisper. "They're from the district attorney's office. They say they have a warrant for a forensic audit of the Sterling Trust, and they're asking for you by name." The heavy thud of the front door being forced open echoed through the foyer, a sound that felt like the final nail in the coffin of the Blackwood name. 2 men in charcoal suits, followed by a pair of uniformed officers, marched into the dining room. They didn't look like the friendly neighborhood bank tellers Eleanor had hoped for. They looked like the grim reapers of the financial world. "Arthur Sterling?" the lead man asked, his voice a flat, bureaucratic monotone. He flashed a badge. "District Attorney's Office, Financial Crimes Division. I'm Special Agent Vance. We have a warrant to seize all financial records, hardware, and personal ledgers associated with the Sterling Trust and its subsidiaries. I remained seated, the steam from the roasted lamb still rising between us. You're making quite an entrance, Agent Vance. I trust you have the proper paperwork? He slapped a thick stack of documents onto the mahogany table, right next to the empty bottle of scotch. We've received a whistleblower tip regarding a massive embezzlement scheme involving the liquidation of offshore assets. We're here to ensure no more accidental losses occur before the state can conduct a full audit. The word embezzlement hung in the air like a poisonous gas. Eleanor let out a sharp, jagged sob, clutching her pearls so hard the string looked ready to snap. Marcus, ever the coward, took a step back, putting distance between himself and me as if my supposed criminality were contagious. But it was Leo whose reaction was the most telling. He wasn't just shocked, he was terrified. His eyes darted between the agents and me, his breathing shallow and panicked. "Embezzlement," Leo stammered, his voice rising an octave. "Wait, if the money was embezzled, does that mean it's gone for good? Or is it being held in escrow? Because I have obligations. I have people I've made promises to." Agent Vance turned his cold gaze toward my grandson. "If the funds were moved illegally to avoid creditors or taxes, they'll be seized by the state, kid. Your obligations are the least of our concerns right now." Leo's face contorted into something I barely recognized. The charming, entitled young man I had raised was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. He turned on me, his finger trembling as he pointed it at my chest. "You did this!" he screamed. "You didn't lose the money in the market. You stole it. You hid it because you didn't want us to have it. You'd rather see the whole family in the gutter than let me take over the company." "Leo, sit down," I said softly, my calm only fueling his rage. "No, I won't sit down." He turned to Agent Vance, his eyes wild. "Officer, listen to me. I had nothing to do with this. I've been trying to tell my mother for months that something was wrong with the books. My grandfather has been acting erratically. He has a private safe in the study, behind the portrait of my grandmother. He keeps a black ledger there. That's where the real records are. I'll show you. I'll give you everything you need." The betrayal was swift and absolute. He didn't even hesitate to offer me up on a silver platter if it meant he could stay in the agent's good graces. Eleanor didn't stop him. She just watched with wide, tearful eyes, her silence a quiet endorsement of her son's treachery. Vance nodded to one of his men. "Secure the study. Follow the kid." Leo led them out of the room with a sickening sense of purpose. I sat there, listening to the heavy boots thumping down the hallway toward my private sanctuary. I heard the frame of my late wife's portrait being roughly pulled from the wall, the metallic click-clack of the safe being tampered with. Minutes later, they returned. Leo was carrying the black leather ledger like a trophy, his face lit with a manic, desperate hope. He thought this was his ticket out. He thought he was saving himself by burying me. "Here," Leo said, slamming the book down in front of Vance. "Everything is in here. Every transfer, every shell company, every offshore account. He's been moving millions into something called the Ghost Protocol for the last 6 months." Vance opened the ledger. I watched him flip through the pages. I knew exactly what was in that book. It wasn't a record of crimes. It was a roadmap of my strategic asset protection plan, a complex, perfectly legal restructuring that moved the family wealth into a series of trusts that neither the DA nor a disgruntled grandson could touch. But to the untrained eye or someone looking for guilt, it looked like the ultimate smoking gun. Vance looked up from the book, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Sterling, this Ghost Protocol, it shows a final transfer of $40 million made just 48 hours ago. The destination is a private account in the Cayman Islands that is no longer in your name." "I told you," Leo shouted, a triumphant, ugly sneer on his face. "He's laundered it. He's left us with nothing while he prepares to flee." Is that true, Mr. Sterling? Vance asked, leaning in. Are you planning on leaving the country? I took a slow, deliberate sip of my scotch. I have no intention of going anywhere, Agent. Everything I have done has been to ensure the long-term stability of the Sterling legacy. Whether my family understands that or not is irrelevant. Legacy? Leo spat. You ruined us. You're going to prison and we're going to be homeless. I hope you rot in a cell knowing you're the man who ended the Blackwood line. Suddenly, one of the officers who had been searching the upstairs bedrooms ran back into the dining room. He was holding a small burner-style flip phone and a stack of printed emails. He didn't hand them to Vance, he handed them to me. No, wait. He didn't hand them to me. He held them up for Vance to see. Sir, the officer said, his voice grim, we found these in the guest suite, the one used by Leo Sterling. Vance took the emails and began to read. The room went silent again, but the tension had shifted. It was no longer pressing down on me. It was radiating toward Leo. Leo's triumphant smile faltered. He looked at the burner phone, then at the emails, and the blood drained from his face until he was the color of chalk. What is that? Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. Leo, what is that? Vance looked at Leo, then back at the papers. It seems we have a conflict of interest. These emails aren't about embezzlement, Mr. Sterling. They're correspondence with a high-level debt collection syndicate out of Eastern Europe. It seems someone has been promising the Sterling estate as collateral for some very illegal gambling debts. Vance turned a page. And it looks like the whistleblower tip we received wasn't about protecting the trust. It was an attempt to force a liquidation so the creditors could get paid. Leo backed away, his hands shaking. I can explain. I was going to pay it back. Once I got my inheritance, it wouldn't have mattered. It matters now, Vance said, his voice dropping an octave. Because according to these records, the people you owe money to don't care about a forensic audit. They want their payment tonight, and they sent us a message through our tip line. Vance looked at the last sheet of paper, then looked at me with a strange, almost pitying expression. Mr. Sterling, Vance said, your grandson didn't just try to frame you. He sold the GPS coordinates of your private mountain retreat to these people. He told them you'd be there tonight with the Ghost Protocol access keys. My heart went cold. I'm not at the retreat, Agent. My youngest granddaughter, Maya, is there. She went up this morning to study in peace. The sound of a helicopter began to thrum in the distance, growing louder by the second, and it wasn't a police chopper. Vance's radio crackled to life. Unit 4. We have a visual on a blacked-out SUV breaching the perimeter of the Sterling estate. They're not waiting for the audit. They're armed, and they're looking for the girl. The roar of the helicopter was no longer a distant hum. It was a rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the very floorboards of the Blackwood estate. Outside, the screech of tires and the crunch of metal against the wrought iron perimeter gates signaled that the situation had shifted from a legal audit to a tactical invasion. Agent Vance's face, which had been so full of bureaucratic arrogance moments ago, was now etched with a sharp, jagged fear. He fumbled for his radio, his fingers trembling. "Control, this is Vance. We have a perimeter breach at the Sterling residence. Armed hostiles. Repeat, armed hostiles. We need immediate backup and—" Static hissed from his radio. A high-pitched whine followed, a frequency jammer cutting off our connection to the outside world. "They've jammed us," Vance whispered, looking at the dead device in his hand. He looked at his two officers who had already drawn their service pistols and were taking positions by the dining room windows. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was just a white-collar seizure. "You brought a knife to a gunfight, Agent Vance," I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. I stood up, not with the frailty of a 72-year-old, but with the deliberate posture of a man who had planned for this exact moment for 3 decades. "Grandfather, what are you doing?" Leo shrieked. He was huddled under the table now, the black ledger he'd tried to use as a weapon against me clutched to his chest like a useless shield. "They're coming for us. They're going to kill us because of your money." "They're coming because of your debts, Leo," I corrected him, looking down at his pathetic form. "You sold the coordinates of the mountain retreat. You told them that's where the Ghost Protocol keys were. You put Maya in the crosshairs to save your own skin." Eleanor let out a strangled cry. "Maya, oh God, my baby girl." She turned to me, her eyes wild with a mixture of terror and blame. "Dad, do something. You always have a way. If you have the money, give it to them. Just save her." "The money is gone, Eleanor," I said, though I didn't look at her. I walked toward the heavy oak sideboard and pressed a hidden sequence of carvings into the wood. With a soft hydraulic hiss, a panel slid back, revealing a sleek, encrypted terminal and a small silver briefcase. At least, the money they think exists is gone. I tapped a command into the terminal. On the wall behind me, a series of monitors flickered to life, displaying high-definition feeds from the mountain retreat 500 miles away. The snow-covered cabin looked peaceful, but as I adjusted the thermal sweep, 4 heat signatures appeared, moving through the tree line toward the porch. "Maya," I whispered into a headset I pulled from the sideboard. "Maya, can you hear me?" A small, terrified voice crackled through the speakers. "Grandpa, Grandpa, there are people outside." The power went out, and the backup generator didn't kick in. "I'm scared." "Listen to me very carefully, sweetheart," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs, though I kept my tone level. "I need you to go into the pantry. Behind the shelf with the canned peaches, there's a small brass handle. Pull it. It will lead you into the sub-basement. Once you're inside, lock the door and don't come out until I tell you. Do you understand?" I understand," she sobbed. As I watched her thermal signature move toward the pantry, I saw the 4 intruders reach the cabin door. One of them held a breaching charge. "Agent Vance," I said, turning back to the room. The front door of the estate was being battered now. The heavy wood was groaning under the assault. "Your men are outmatched. These aren't just debt collectors. They're the Vultures, a mercenary group that specializes in high-value asset recovery. They think they're here to collect $40 million. They don't realize they're walking into a slaughterhouse." "What are you talking about?" Vance demanded, his gun aimed at the dining room door. "What slaughterhouse?" I didn't answer him. I opened the silver briefcase. Inside wasn't cash or gold. It was a series of biometric scanners and a satellite uplink. My strategic asset protection plan wasn't just about moving numbers between banks, Vance. It was about defining what an asset is. In my world, an asset is something that must be defended at all costs. And a liability is something that must be liquidated. I looked at Leo, then Marcus, then Eleanor. They stared back at me, frozen. "The Ghost Protocol," I continued, "is a private security infrastructure I've funded through shell companies for 20 years. It consists of a rapid response team of former Tier 1 operators who are currently stationed in 5 hidden locations across the country. One of those locations is 3 miles from the mountain retreat." I pressed my thumb onto the scanner. "Biometrics confirmed," a synthetic voice announced. "Ghost Protocol initiated." "Grandfather?" Leo asked, his voice trembling. "What does that mean? Are they going to save Maya?" "They are already moving to extract her," I said, "but the protocol has 2 phases, extraction and sanitization." A massive explosion rocked the front of the house. The foyer windows shattered, showering the hallway in glass. A flashbang grenade detonated, filling the house with a blinding white light and a deafening roar. I felt the heat of the blast even in the dining room. Vance's officers began firing, the pop, pop, pop of their handguns, sounding pathetic against the heavy, rhythmic chugging of automatic weapons. "Get down!" Vance yelled, diving for cover behind a heavy sofa. The dining room doors were kicked open. Two men in black tactical gear wearing night vision goggles and carrying suppressed submachine guns stepped into the room. They didn't look for the silver or the paintings. They looked straight at me. "Arthur Sterling," the lead mercenary said, his voice muffled by his mask. "Where is the ledger? Where are the keys?" Leo scrambled out from under the table, his hands held high. "I have it. I have the ledger. Here, just take it and let me go. I'm the one who called you. I'm on your side." The mercenary didn't even look at him. He raised his weapon and fired a single shot. The bullet hit the table inches from Leo's hand, sending a spray of mahogany splinters into his face. Leo screamed, collapsing back onto the floor, clutching his bleeding cheek. "The old man has the keys," the mercenary said, stepping toward me. "The boy is a cockroach. Kill the rest. Keep the old man alive until he talks." He raised his gun toward Eleanor and Marcus. Eleanor shrieked, covering her head. Marcus tried to crawl away, but he was backed into a corner. "Wait," I said, standing my ground. I held up a small black remote with a single red button. "You want the Ghost Protocol? You want the access to the offshore billions?" The mercenary paused. "Hand it over." "I told you," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "The money isn't where you think it is, and the keys aren't digital." I pressed the button. Suddenly, the monitors on the wall didn't show the mountain retreat anymore. They showed the dining room we were standing in, but the view was from the ceiling, from hidden turrets that were now sliding out from the crown molding. "Phase 2, I whispered. "Sanitization." The room erupted into a symphony of mechanical whirs and high-caliber gunfire. But as the mercenaries dove for cover, the lead man grabbed Leo by the throat, hauling him up as a human shield. "Stop!" the mercenary roared. "Stop the turrets or the kid dies." I looked at Leo, the grandson who had betrayed me, who had endangered his sister, who had tried to sell my life for his gambling debts. I looked at the red button in my hand. Then my headset crackled. It was a new voice, deep, professional, and cold. "Sir, this is Ghost Lead. We have arrived at the mountain retreat. We have a problem." "Did you get Maya?" I asked, my heart stopping. "The cabin is empty, sir," the voice replied. "But there's a note on the pantry door. It's addressed to you. It says, 'The girl for the protocol. Meet us at the old mill in 20 minutes or she's liquidated.'" I looked at the mercenary holding Leo, then at the monitor. The mercenary's radio chirped. He listened for a second, then a grin spread beneath his mask. "Change of plans, Mr. Sterling," the mercenary said. "It seems my team was faster than yours. We don't need you to give us the keys. We just need you to watch what we do to your granddaughter if you don't come with us right now." He shoved Leo aside and pointed his gun directly at my head. "Drop the remote. Now." I looked at the screen, at the empty cabin, then back at the man who held my life in his hands. But then I noticed something on the monitor that the mercenaries hadn't. A small, rhythmic blinking light coming from the sub-basement of the cabin. A Morse code signal. "I'm not in the basement," it blinked. "They have the wrong girl." I froze. If Maya wasn't in the cabin and the mercenaries thought they had her, then who was currently in the hands of the most dangerous men in the country? The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of ozone and cordite. My finger hovered over the remote, my mind racing faster than the high-caliber turrets, tracking the movements of the men in black. They have the wrong girl. The Morse code signal from the cabin's hidden sub-level was unmistakable. Maya was safe, or at least she was still hidden. But if the vultures believed they had her, then who was currently being transported to the old mill? I looked at the lead mercenary, the one who was still grinning behind his tactical mask, unaware that his leverage was a phantom. Then I looked at Eleanor, whose face was a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. She thought her daughter was minutes away from a brutal end. And then there was Leo, whimpering on the floor, a man who had sold his soul for a seat at a table that no longer existed. "I'll ask you one more time, Sterling," the mercenary growled, pressing the barrel of his suppressed weapon into the soft skin beneath my jaw. "Drop the remote, or we start with the boy's other cheek." I slowly lowered my hand, letting the black plastic device clatter onto the mahogany table. The overhead turrets let out a disappointed mechanical whine as they powered down, their red targeting lasers flickering out. "Smart move," the mercenary said. He keyed his radio. "We have the principal. Get the transport ready at the south gate, and tell the team at the mill to prep the girl. We're going to need her to make the old man talk." "Wait!" Eleanor screamed, throwing herself toward the mercenary. "Take me! Please take me instead! She's just a child!" The mercenary backhanded her with the butt of his weapon. She collapsed into Marcus's arms, sobbing. "Nobody's going anywhere except the old man," the mercenary said. He grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "And the boy, he's coming too. He's our insurance policy in case the DA here tries anything heroic." Agent Vance was still crouched behind the sofa, his pistol shaking in his hand. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a plan, for a miracle. I gave him a nearly imperceptible shake of my head. "Stay down." They hauled me, and a trembling, hysterical Leo out of the dining room, through the wreckage of my foyer and into the cold night air. A blacked-out SUV sat idling at the end of the driveway, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow. They threw us into the back, the heavy doors slamming shut with the finality of a prison cell. As the SUV roared away from the estate, Leo turned to me, his voice a pathetic wheeze. "Grandfather, please tell them. Give them the money. I don't want to die. I didn't mean for this to happen. I just wanted what was mine." "You have exactly what is yours, Leo," I said, staring out the tinted window at the passing trees. "You have the consequences of your choices. That is the only legacy you've earned." The drive to the old mill was 20 minutes of agonizing silence, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the mercenaries' tactical comms. My mind was back at the cabin. If Maya was safe in the sub-basement, who was the girl the mercenaries had snatched? I had a secondary security detail, yes, but they were supposed to be miles away, unless... A memory flickered in the back of my mind. 3 years ago, I had hired a tutor for Maya, a young woman named Sarah who specialized in environmental awareness and self-defense. I had told the family she was a graduate student from the university. In reality, she was a former Mossad operative I'd put on a permanent retainer. If Sarah had been at the cabin... The SUV slowed to a crawl as we turned onto the gravel path leading to the old mill, a derelict 5-story stone structure that had been a landmark in this county for a century. Now, it was a tomb. The vehicle stopped. The doors were yanked open and we were dragged out into the freezing wind. The mill was surrounded by 3 more black SUVs. Men with rifles patrolled the perimeter. In the center of the clearing, under the glare of a portable floodlight, sat a chair. And in that chair sat a girl with a burlap sack over her head, her hands zip-tied behind her back. "There she is," the lead mercenary said, shoving me toward the chair. "Your precious granddaughter. Now let's talk about the Ghost Protocol access codes. My employer is a very impatient man, Arthur. He's already waited 40 years for the sterling fortune to be liquidated." "Your employer?" I asked, my eyes fixed on the hooded figure. "You're working for Miller, aren't you? The man I outmaneuvered in the '98 merger." The mercenary laughed. "Miller is small fry. My boss is someone who knows you very well, someone who's been inside your house, someone who knows exactly where you hide your secrets." He walked over to the hooded girl and grabbed the burlap sack. "Say hello to your legacy, Arthur." He ripped the hood off. It wasn't Maya. It wasn't even Sarah. It was a young woman I didn't recognize. Her face was bruised, her eyes wide with terror, but she was wearing Maya's favorite red ski jacket. "Who is this?" the mercenary demanded, his voice dropping an octave as he realized the discrepancy. He turned to one of his men. "I told you to get the Sterling girl." "She was in the kitchen," the man stammered. She matched the description. Red jacket, blonde hair. "You idiots!" the mercenary roared. But I wasn't looking at the girl. I was looking at the red jacket. Specifically, the small blinking LED light embedded in the zipper, a light that was currently pulsing in sync with the heartbeat of whoever was wearing it. It wasn't a tracker, it was a detonator. "Where is she?" I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the tree line, amplified by a megaphone. It wasn't the voice of my security team. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 15 years, a voice that should have been silenced in a private plane crash over the Andes. "She's with me, Arthur," the voice said, echoing through the valley. A figure stepped out of the shadows. He was tall, silver-haired, and wearing a suit that cost more than most people's houses. Behind him, held firmly by the arm, was Maya. She looked unharmed, but her face was pale with shock. "Hello, brother," the man said, a cold, predatory smile on his face. "Julian?" I gasped. "My older brother. The man who had tried to burn the family business to the ground before I'd had him declared legally dead to protect the assets. You thought you could hide it all in the Ghost Protocol," Julian said, gesturing to the mercenaries. "You thought you were the only one who knew how to play the long game. But I've been watching. I've been waiting. And I've been teaching Maya things you never would." Maya looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see the innocent girl I had tried to protect. I saw a coldness in her eyes that mirrored my own. "Grandfather," she said, her voice steady and devoid of emotion. "You shouldn't have lied to me about the trust. You should have told me I was the only one who was actually a Sterling." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small black device, the twin to the remote I had dropped back at the house. "The Ghost Protocol doesn't belong to you anymore," she said. She pressed a button, and the red light on the jacket of the girl in the chair turned from blinking to a solid, angry crimson. "Wait!" I shouted, reaching out. But Maya didn't look at me. She looked at Julian, and then she looked at the mercenaries. "The girl in the chair isn't a hostage," Maya said. "She's the payload, and you all just let her into the middle of your perimeter." The ground beneath us began to vibrate, not from a helicopter, but from something deep underground. The old mill groaned as the stone foundations began to shift. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice a silky purr, "did you really think I'd come all this way just for the money? I'm here for the only thing that actually matters. I'm here to see which one of us is willing to let the whole legacy burn to keep the other from having it." He handed Maya a gun. "Go ahead, sweetheart. Show him what a real Sterling does when the asset is compromised." Maya raised the weapon, but she didn't point it at the girl in the chair. She didn't point it at me. She pointed it directly at the chest of the mercenary leader holding Leo. "The detonator is voice-activated," Maya said, her voice echoing in the sudden, terrifying silence. "And I'm the only one with the frequency. Grandfather, if you want to save Leo and the rest of the family back at the house, you have exactly 10 seconds to give Uncle Julian the override key for the offshore accounts." 10, she began, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Maya, don't!" I cried. 9, she continued, her eyes fixed on mine. 8, 7. As she reached 6, a secondary explosion rocked the hills behind us, and the sky turned a brilliant, hellish orange. One of my secret storage facilities had just been vaporized. 5, she whispered. I realized then that I hadn't just protected the legacy. I had created a monster. "Wait," I yelled. "I'll give it to you. But you have to let them go." Julian laughed. "Oh, Arthur, you still don't get it. There is no letting go. There's only winning. And Maya, she's already won." Maya smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. She didn't stop counting. 4, 3, 2. And then she didn't say 1. She said a single word that made my blood turn to ice. "Checkmate." The word checkmate hadn't been a command to detonate a bomb. It was a voice-coded trigger for a very specific, very expensive piece of military-grade hardware hidden within the payload girl's jacket. Instead of a fiery explosion, a blinding, high-frequency strobe light erupted from the girl's chest, accompanied by a localized EMP pulse and a deafening subsonic wall of sound. The mercenaries, geared for night combat with sensitive optical equipment and earpieces, were instantly incapacitated. They collapsed, clutching their heads, their high-tech goggles burning out their retinas. In that fraction of a second, the girl in the chair, then who was actually Sarah, the Mossad-trained tutor, snapped her zip ties, which were made of brittle sugar plastic, and rolled toward the nearest SUV. "Down, everyone down!" I bellowed, tackling the stunned Leo to the gravel. Through the chaos, I saw Maya. She hadn't flinched. She stood perfectly still, her eyes shielded by a pair of specialized lenses I'd given her for her 16th birthday. She didn't shoot Julian. She didn't shoot the mercenaries. She simply pointed her weapon at the sky and fired a single flare. The woods erupted, not with the frantic shouting of the vultures, but with the silent, terrifying efficiency of the Ghost Protocol. My extraction team, the real one, emerged from the shadows like ghosts. They didn't use flashbangs or shouts. They used suppressed rifles and surgical precision. Within 60 seconds, every mercenary in the clearing was neutralized, either unconscious or zip-tied. Julian stood in the center of the clearing, the only man left standing. He looked around at his fallen army, his predatory smile finally flickering. He looked at Maya, who still held the gun, and then at me, as I stood up, brushing the snow from my knees. "You always were a theatrical bastard, Arthur," Julian spat, though his voice lacked its previous bravado. "A high-frequency strobe, a fake hostage, you risked your own granddaughter for a parlor trick?" "I didn't risk her, Julian," I said, stepping toward him. "I trusted her. There's a difference." Maya walked over to me, her face softening as she handed me the weapon. "He contacted me 2 months ago, Grandpa. He told me you were going senile, that you were going to lose everything and leave us with nothing. He offered me a seat at his table." I looked at my youngest granddaughter. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him a Sterling always protects the primary asset," she said, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "I just didn't tell him that the asset wasn't the money. It was you." I felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly brought me to my feet. I had spent 40 years building a fortune, but in 10 minutes, I realized I had finally built something that would outlast it. "And what about the Ghost Protocol?" Julian asked, his eyes darting toward the silver briefcase I'd brought from the house. "The 40 million? The Cayman accounts?" "Non-existent," I said. "The Ghost Protocol isn't a fund, Julian. It's a contingency plan. The money you saw moving across those ledgers was a digital lure. It was honeypot currency, traceable, locked, and designed to trigger an automatic federal alert the moment an unauthorized user tried to access it. You didn't just fail to steal it. You signaled your location to every intelligence agency I have on speed dial." Julian's face went pale. You burned $40 million just to catch me?" "I didn't burn a cent," I replied. "The money never left the Sterling Core accounts. I just made it look like it was gone to see who would try to scavenge the remains." I turned to Leo, who was shivering on the ground, his face a mess of dirt and tears. He looked at me, then at Maya, his eyes filled with a hollow realization. "Grandfather," Leo whispered, "the estate. Is it really gone? Are we really broke?" "The Blackwood estate is owned by a private trust," I said, my voice cold. "A trust that has very strict clauses regarding moral turpitude and familial betrayal. By attempting to sell the family's security to a known criminal element, you, your mother, and Marcus have effectively disinherited yourselves. You aren't broke, Leo. You're just excluded. You'll have a modest stipend, enough for a studio apartment and a bus pass. But the Sterling name? That stays with those who know how to carry it." Leo let out a broken sob, the reality of his new life, a life of mediocrity, finally sinking in. Agent Vance and his team arrived 10 minutes later, their communications restored. They found a clearing full of bound mercenaries and a very dead man who was very much alive and headed for a federal black site. Vance looked at me, then at the black ledger I was holding. "I assume you have an explanation for all of this, Mr. Sterling?" Vance asked, looking weary. "A simple misunderstanding, Agent," I said, handing him a different folder from my coat pocket. "Here is the documentation for the Ghost Protocol, a private, fully licensed security firm I've been using to assist the government in tracking international debt syndicates. You'll find all the embezzled funds are accounted for in a temporary escrow account held by the Treasury. I believe your whistleblower tip was actually a lead on a major criminal conspiracy." Vance looked at the papers, then at the captured Julian. He knew he'd been played, but he also knew that Arthur Sterling had just handed him the biggest win of his career. He nodded slowly. "We'll be in touch, Arthur." As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the snow, Maya and I stood by the SUV. The old mill sat silent behind us, a relic of a past that had almost claimed us. "So," Maya said, looking at the estate-bound vehicles, "what happens now? Mom and Dad are going to be difficult." "They will be handled," I said. "But the Strategic Asset Protection Plan isn't finished. I have one more move to make." "And what's that?" I looked at her. This brilliant, sharp, terrifyingly capable young woman. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, old-fashioned brass key. Not a digital override, not a biometric trigger. Just a key to the small library in the West Wing. "I'm retiring, Maya," I said. "Truly retiring. The Blackwood estate is being converted into the Sterling Foundation for Economic Ethics, and you are going to be the chairperson." Maya took the key, her eyes widening. "Me? But I'm only 21. "You're a Sterling," I said, patting her hand. "You've already proven you can handle the vultures. Now, you just have to learn how to manage the lions." As we drove back toward the house, the "My legacy is gone" headlines that Leo had feared so much felt like a distant memory. The money was safe, the enemies were gone, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about who would hold the crown. I leaned back in the seat, the leather creaking in a way that finally sounded like peace. My legacy wasn't gone. It had just finally been found.